When desperate widower Samuel Carter bid his last dollar on a Nebraska cattle ranch in 1867, he thought he was buying land and livestock, but the deed came with 2 orphaned children and a deadly secret that powerful men would kill to keep buried. What happens when the person who has nothing left to lose discovers something worth dying for? The auctioneer's hammer crashed down like thunder, and Samuel Carter couldn't believe what just happened. His trembling hand still held up in the air, his heart beating so fast it might burst right out of his chest. Around him, other men shook their heads and walked away, their boots kicking up dust clouds in the hot Nebraska sun. "Sold to the man in the black hat for $1. The auctioneer called out again, pointing straight at Samuel. Samuel looked down at his empty pockets, then at the crumpled paper in his other hand. The auction notice was so worn from his reading it that the words were getting hard to see. But he could still make out the most important part. Entire cattle ranch, with 200 head of cattle, house and all equipment. Starting bid, $1. That's all he had left in the whole world. The year was 1867, and the Nebraska territory stretched out like an endless ocean of brown grass and blue sky. Samuel had never seen so much empty space in his life. Back in Missouri, there were always trees and hills and neighbors close by. Here, the wind blew across miles and miles without hitting anything but more grass. "You sure about this, mister?" The auctioneer climbed down from his wooden box and handed Samuel a thick envelope. Most folks who bid on the Brennan place know something about it that keeps them away. Samuel's throat felt like he'd been eating sand. What kind of something? Well, Jacob Brennan was a good man, don't get me wrong. But that ranch, the auctioneer shook his head. Let's just say there's reasons it's going so cheap. Before Samuel could ask more questions, the auctioneer was already moving on to the next lot. Samuel stood there holding the envelope, watching the last few people climb into their wagons and head back to town. Soon, he was completely alone, except for the wind and a skinny horse tied to a post nearby. The horse looked almost as tired as Samuel felt. Its brown coat was dusty, and its head hung low like it hadn't eaten a good meal in weeks. A small wagon sat behind it, loaded with a few tools and supplies that must have come with the ranch purchase. Samuel walked over and patted the horse's neck. "Well, boy, looks like we're partners now." The horse lifted its head and looked at Samuel with big dark eyes that seemed to understand exactly how desperate things had gotten. Samuel had sold everything he owned just to buy the train ticket west. His farm in Missouri was gone, taken by the bank after Martha died. His wife had been sick for months before the fever finally took her, and all the doctor bills had eaten up their savings like hungry wolves. Now Martha was buried in a cemetery he'd never see again. And Samuel was standing in the middle of nowhere with a dollar ranch and no idea what he was getting into. He opened the envelope and pulled out the deed. The paper was official looking, with fancy writing and a big red seal at the bottom. Samuel Carter, it read, is now the legal owner of the Brennan Ranch, including all buildings, equipment, and livestock currently on the property. Currently on the property. That was interesting. Did that mean some of the cattle might not be there anymore? Samuel climbed up onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins. The horse snorted and started walking without being told, like it knew exactly where to go. As they rolled away from the auction site, Samuel looked back at the small town one more time. A few people stood watching from doorways and windows, but nobody waved goodbye. The wagon wheels creaked and groaned as they rolled across the rough prairie trail. Samuel had never driven a wagon before. Back in Missouri, they'd had a small farm with just a couple of plow horses. This was different. The land here was so big it made him feel like a tiny ant crawling across a giant's table. After about an hour, the horse stopped at a fork in the trail. Samuel looked around, confused. There were no signs, no markers, just 2 wheel ruts heading in different directions. One path went north towards some low hills, and the other continued west across flat grassland. "Which way, boy?" Samuel asked the horse. The horse turned its head north and started walking before Samuel could decide. Samuel figured the animal probably knew the way better than he did, so he let it choose. As they climbed toward the hills, Samuel started seeing things that made his stomach twist with worry. First, it was just scattered bones bleaching white in the sun. Then he saw the remains of a campfire that looked like it had been used recently. Finally, he spotted something that made him pull back on the reins and stop the wagon completely. Buzzards. At least a dozen of them circling in the sky ahead. Samuel had grown up on a farm, so he knew what buzzards meant. Something was dead up there, something big. Maybe several somethings. The horse seemed nervous too, snorting and pawing the ground. But it was too late to turn back now. Samuel had spent his last dollar on this ranch, and he needed to see what he'd bought, even if it turned out to be trouble. He clicked his tongue and urged the horse forward. As they got closer to where the buzzards were circling, Samuel could smell it, the sweet, sick smell of death carried on the wind. His stomach churned, but he kept going. Around the next bend in the trail, Samuel saw his first glimpse of the Brennan Ranch. And what he saw made him wonder if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. The ranch house sat in a small valley, surrounded by corrals and barns that looked empty and abandoned. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the field beyond the house, where dozens of cattle lay dead in the grass, their bodies swollen and black under the hot sun. Samuel stopped the wagon at the edge of the property and just stared. This wasn't a working cattle ranch. It was a graveyard. "What in the world happened here?" he whispered. As if in answer to his question, movement caught his eye near the house. Someone was walking around the buildings, too far away to see clearly. Samuel squinted against the sun, trying to make out who it might be. The figure disappeared behind the barn, then came out again carrying what looked like a shovel. Samuel watched as whoever it was walked over to a spot near the house and started digging. Samuel's heart started beating fast again. Who was that? And what were they burying? He climbed down from the wagon, his legs shaky from the long ride and the shock of what he was seeing. The deed in his pocket said he owned this place now, but it sure didn't feel like his. It felt like he was trespassing on someone else's tragedy. The horse whinnied softly, as if it could sense Samuel's fear. Samuel patted its neck again, trying to calm both the animal and himself. "Easy, boy. We're just going to go introduce ourselves and find out what's going on." But as Samuel started walking toward the house, three things happened that made him freeze in his tracks. First, he heard a gunshot echo across the valley. Then, he heard voices shouting, though he couldn't make out the words. Finally, he saw the person with the shovel drop their tool and run toward the house like their life depended on it. Samuel ducked behind the wagon, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. What kind of place had he bought? And more importantly, what kind of danger was he walking into? As he crouched there trying to decide what to do next, Samuel heard something that chilled his blood. It was the sound of horses galloping, getting closer fast, and whoever was riding them wasn't coming for a friendly visit. The riders came over the hill like a storm cloud, their horses kicking up dust devils in the afternoon heat. Samuel pressed himself closer to the wagon wheel, counting at least 6 men on horseback heading straight for the ranch house. Their faces were hard, and they rode with the kind of purpose that meant trouble for anyone in their way. Samuel's mouth went dry as old leather. These weren't neighbors coming to welcome him to the area. From his hiding spot, he watched the riders surround the ranch house like wolves circling a wounded deer. The person with the shovel had disappeared completely, probably hiding inside. One of the riders dismounted and walked up to the front porch, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Jacob Brennan!" the man shouted. "We know you're in there. Time to settle up." Silence hung over the valley like smoke from a grass fire. Samuel could hear his own breathing and the nervous snorting of his horse, but nothing else. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Brennan," the rider called again. "You've got something that belongs to us." Still no answer from the house. The rider looked back at his companions and shrugged. 2 more men dismounted and started walking around the building, checking windows and doors. Samuel noticed they all wore guns and moved like men who knew how to use them. Samuel's mind raced like a spooked Mustang. The auction papers said Jacob Brennan was the previous owner, but they hadn't mentioned that he might still be living here, or that dangerous men might be looking for him. What had Samuel gotten himself into? One of the riders searching around back suddenly shouted, "Boss, you need to see this!" The leader and the other mounted men rode around to the back of the house. Samuel couldn't see what they found, but their voices carried on the wind. "Well, I'll be damned," the leader said. "Looks like old Jacob solved our problem himself. What do we do now?" Another voice asked. "Search the place, find what we came for, and keep your eyes open. Someone's been digging fresh graves around here." Samuel felt ice form in his stomach, despite the hot sun beating down on his back. Fresh graves? What had happened at this ranch before he arrived? The men spent the next hour tearing the place apart. Samuel watched from behind the wagon as they went through every building, throwing furniture out of windows and kicking over barrels. Whatever they were looking for, they wanted it badly enough to destroy the place searching for it. Finally, the leader came back outside, his face red with anger. "It's not here. Brennan must have hidden it somewhere else." "What about the cattle?" one of his men asked. "The ones that didn't die?" Samuel's ears perked up at that. Some cattle had survived whatever killed the others? "They're probably up in the summer pasture," the leader replied. "Brennan always moved his healthy stock up there when trouble started. We'll deal with that later." The summer pasture. Samuel filed that information away in his mind. If there were still living cattle somewhere on his new property, he needed to know about it. The riders mounted up and prepared to leave, but their leader paused and looked around the valley one more time. "Keep an eye on this place. If anyone comes sniffing around, I want to know about it. What if it's just drifters or settlers?" The leader's smile was colder than winter wind. Then they picked a bad time to visit the Brennan place. The riders galloped away, leaving behind only dust clouds and an eerie quiet. Samuel waited until they were completely out of sight before he dared to move. His legs had gone stiff from crouching behind the wagon for so long, and his shirt was soaked with sweat that had nothing to do with the heat. He stood up slowly, looking around to make sure he was really alone. The ranch house sat there looking innocent enough, but Samuel now knew it held secrets that men were willing to kill for. Taking a deep breath, Samuel unhitched his horse from the wagon and led it toward the house. If he was going to live here, and he had to, since he had nowhere else to go, he needed to understand what he was dealing with. The front door hung open, broken off its hinges by the rider's rough search. Samuel stepped inside and immediately wished he hadn't. The place looked like a tornado had gone through it. Furniture was overturned, papers scattered everywhere, and most of the windows were broken. But underneath the destruction, Samuel could see that this had once been a nice home. The walls were solid timber, and someone had taken care to make it comfortable. Family pictures lay scattered on the floor, showing a man with a beard and kind eyes, sometimes alone, sometimes with other people Samuel didn't recognize. In what must have been the kitchen, Samuel found something that made his heart skip a beat. A child's wooden toy sat on the windowsill, a small horse with wheels, painted red and yellow. One of the wheels was missing, and the paint was worn from lots of playing. Samuel picked up the toy and turned it over in his hands. Children had lived in this house. Where were they now? A noise from upstairs made Samuel freeze. It sounded like footsteps, slow and careful. Someone else was in the house. Samuel looked around for something to defend himself with and spotted a poker from the fireplace. He picked it up with shaking hands and started toward the stairs. "Hello?" he called softly. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long moment, a voice answered, high and young, like a child trying to sound braver than they felt. "Stay back! I've got a gun." Samuel almost laughed with relief. A child. Just a scared kid, probably hiding from those riders. "It's okay," Samuel said gently. "They're gone. I'm not here to hurt you." "You're one of them," the voice accused. You came with the others. No, I didn't. I came alone, in a wagon. My name is Samuel Carter, and well, I think I own this place now. Silence stretched out like taffy. Then Samuel heard the creaking of floorboards as someone moved around upstairs. You can't own it, the voice said finally. This is our home, our home. That meant there was more than one child up there. Samuel sat down on the bottom step of the staircase, still holding the toy horse. What's your name? He asked. Another long pause. Then, Rebecca. This is my brother Matthew. We live here with Papa. Samuel felt his heart sink. These children didn't know their father was dead. Those riders had found Jacob Brennan's body, and now Samuel was going to have to figure out how to tell two kids that they were orphans. Rebecca, he said carefully, where is your papa right now? The voice wavered, and Samuel heard whispering upstairs. When Rebecca spoke again, she sounded smaller, younger. He's been sleeping for a long time, behind the barn, under the ground. Samuel closed his eyes. So the children did know. They'd been living here alone. God only knew for how long, taking care of themselves while dangerous men searched for whatever their father had hidden. How long has it been? Samuel asked gently. 3 weeks, Rebecca replied. Maybe 4. The days run together. Samuel stood up slowly and started climbing the stairs, moving as unthreatening as possible. Rebecca, Matthew, you must be hungry and scared. I'm not going to hurt you, but we need to talk. When he reached the top of the stairs, Samuel saw them huddled together in what must have been their parents' bedroom. Rebecca looked to be about 8 years old, with tangled red hair and eyes that had seen too much. Matthew appeared younger, maybe 5, and he clung to his sister like she was the only solid thing in a world gone crazy. Both children were too thin, their clothes dirty and torn. But Rebecca held an old hunting rifle like she knew how to use it, and her eyes were fierce, despite her fear. You really bought our ranch? She asked. Samuel nodded and pulled the deed from his pocket. For $1. I didn't know anyone was still living here. Rebecca studied the paper with the serious expression of a child forced to grow up too fast. Papa said someone might come eventually. Said if they had the right papers, we should. She trailed off, looking at her brother. Should what? Samuel prompted gently. Should decide if they're good people or bad people. Matthew spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel looked at these two brave, scared children and felt something shift in his chest. He'd come west, looking for a new start, a way to rebuild his life after losing everything. He never expected to find two kids who needed him as much as he needed a reason to keep going. Well, he said, sitting down on the floor so he wouldn't tower over them, I guess that's up to you to decide. But I'll tell you this. I lost my wife a few months ago, and I've been pretty lonely since then. This big house seems like it could use some people in it to make it feel like a home again. Rebecca and Matthew exchanged a look that held an entire conversation. Finally, Rebecca lowered the rifle. Are you hungry, Mr. Carter? She asked. I can make beans and cornbread if we still have flour. Samuel smiled for the first time in months. That sounds like the best meal I could ask for. But as they headed downstairs together, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that those riders would be back. And when they came, he'd better be ready to protect not just his $1 ranch, but the two children who were quickly becoming the most valuable thing on it. A scream cut through the night like a knife through butter, jolting Samuel awake from the first real sleep he'd had in weeks. He rolled off the makeshift bed he'd made on the living room floor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The scream came again, high, terrified, and definitely from upstairs where the children were sleeping. Samuel grabbed the poker from beside the cold fireplace and took the stairs 3 at a time. Moonlight streamed through the broken windows, casting weird shadows that danced on the walls like ghosts. He found Matthew sitting up in the small bed he shared with Rebecca, his face white as fresh snow, and his whole body shaking like a leaf in a storm. The bad dreams came back, Rebecca whispered, stroking her little brother's hair with gentle hands. They always do when strangers are in the house. Samuel set down the poker and knelt beside the bed. Matthew's eyes were wide open, but he seemed to be looking at something none of them could see. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool night air drifting through the broken window. "What does he dream about?" Samuel asked quietly. Rebecca's face grew dark as a thundercloud. "The night Papa got sick. The night those men came the first time." Samuel felt ice water run down his spine. "Those riders were here before?" "Papa hid us in the root cellar," Rebecca continued, her voice barely above a whisper. But Matthew peeked through the cracks in the floorboards. He saw things a little boy shouldn't see. Matthew suddenly grabbed Samuel's shirt with both tiny fists. "They hurt Papa," he said, his voice thick with tears. "They made him tell where he hid the special thing. But Papa wouldn't say. So they—" "Shh," Rebecca said quickly, pulling her brother close. "Don't think about it anymore." But Samuel needed to know. If those men had been willing to hurt Jacob Brennan once, they'd do it again to anyone who got in their way, including 2 children and a foolish man who'd bought trouble for $1. "Rebecca," Samuel said carefully, "what special thing were they looking for?" The girl's eyes darted around the dark room, like she was checking for listeners hiding in the shadows. Then she leaned close to Samuel and whispered words that changed everything. "Papa found gold." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire. Samuel stared at Rebecca, wondering if he'd heard wrong. "Gold? Here in Nebraska territory? Not gold you dig from the ground," Rebecca explained, reading the confusion on his face. "Gold coins. Lots of them. In leather bags. Papa found them buried under the old oak tree by the creek." Samuel's mind started racing faster than a Mustang with its tail on fire. Buried gold meant one thing: stolen gold. Bank robbery, stagecoach holdup, or worse. And if Jacob Brennan had found it, others would know about it too. "Where is it now?" Samuel asked. Rebecca and Matthew exchanged another one of their silent conversations. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "Papa moved it. Said it was too dangerous to keep close to the house. But he didn't tell us where." A new sound drifted through the night air. Hoofbeats. Still distant, but getting closer. Samuel's blood turned to ice. The riders were coming back, just like their leader had promised. "Get dressed," Samuel whispered urgently. "Both of you, right now." "Why?" Matthew asked. But he was already climbing out of bed. "Because we're leaving. Tonight." Samuel rushed to the window and peered out at the moonlit valley. He could see dust clouds rising in the distance, moving toward the ranch like approaching storm clouds. At least 4 riders, maybe more. "Where will we go?" Rebecca asked, as she helped Matthew into his pants and boots. Samuel thought fast. They couldn't outrun horses with just one tired wagon animal. They needed somewhere to hide until morning. Somewhere those men wouldn't think to look. "The root cellar you mentioned," Samuel decided. "Can you show me?" Rebecca nodded and led them downstairs to a trapdoor hidden under a braided rug in the kitchen. Samuel lifted the heavy wooden door, revealing a small underground room stocked with preserved vegetables and canned goods. It smelled like earth and potatoes, but it would keep them safe. "Down you go," Samuel whispered, helping Matthew into the dark space. "What about you?" Rebecca asked. "I'll be right behind you," Samuel lied. He couldn't hide while those men destroyed what little the children had left. Someone needed to face them, and it might as well be the fool who'd bought into this mess. Samuel waited until both children were safely underground, then lowered the trapdoor and pulled the rug back over it. He grabbed the Spencer rifle from where Jacob Brennan had kept it mounted above the fireplace, checked to make sure it was loaded, and positioned himself by the front window. The riders came into the yard like a pack of wolves returning to a fresh kill. Samuel counted 6 men this time, all armed and looking mean as stepped-on rattlesnakes. Their leader was the same man from before, tall, thin, with a face that looked like it had never smiled at anything good. "Brennan!" the leader shouted. "We know you're still around here somewhere. Come out, and maybe we'll make this quick." Samuel took a deep breath and stepped out onto the porch. The rifle held ready, but not pointed directly at anyone yet. The moonlight made everything look silver and strange, like a dream where nothing was quite real. "Jacob Brennan's dead," Samuel called out. "I'm the new owner." The leader's horse pranced nervously as he studied Samuel with cold, calculating eyes. "That's so. Got papers to prove it?" Samuel pulled the deed from his pocket and held it up. "Bought it legal at auction yesterday. $1. That got a laugh from some of the riders, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was the kind of laugh bullies make when they find someone smaller to pick on. $1, the leader repeated. "Well, mister, I'm afraid you didn't get quite the bargain you thought. See, Brennan had something that belongs to my employer, something valuable. Until we get it back, this property is still very much in dispute." "I don't know anything about that," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Course you don't. But here's the thing. We're going to search this place from top to bottom until we find what we're looking for. And if you're smart, you'll just ride on out of here and pretend you never saw this place." Samuel thought about the 2 children hiding in the cellar below, depending on him to protect them. He thought about Martha, and how she'd always said a man's worth was measured by what he was willing to stand up for. "I'm not going anywhere," Samuel said. The leader's smile disappeared, like morning mist. Wrong answer. What happened next was a blur of motion and violence that Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. 2 riders spurred their horses toward the porch, while the others spread out to surround the house. Samuel dove sideways as bullets splintered the wood where he'd been standing, rolled behind a water barrel, and came up firing. The Spencer rifle boomed like thunder, and one of the charging riders tumbled from his saddle. Samuel worked the lever action and fired again, missing but forcing the other rider to veer away from the port. "Burn him out!" the leader shouted. "Check the barn first!" Samuel's heart nearly stopped. If they searched the barn thoroughly, they might find the entrance to the root cellar from outside. He had to keep their attention on him and away from the children. He fired 2 more shots, then ran from window to window inside the house, making as much noise as possible. He overturned furniture, slammed doors, and shouted challenges at the riders to make them think there were more people inside. The trick worked for a while. The riders focused their fire on the house, sending bullets through windows and walls in a deadly storm of lead and splinters. But Samuel was running low on ammunition, and he knew they'd realize soon enough that he was alone. Then he heard the worst sound possible, Matthew's voice, calling out from somewhere near the barn. "Rebecca, where are you?" Samuel's blood turned to ice water. The little boy had gotten scared in the dark cellar and come looking for his sister. Now he was outside, in the open, with 6 armed men hunting for anything connected to the missing gold. Samuel watched in horror as one of the riders spotted Matthew's small form running between the outbuildings. The man raised his rifle, taking careful aim at a 5-year-old child. Without thinking, Samuel burst out of the house and charged across the yard, screaming like a madman. He tackled the mounted rider just as the gun fired, sending both of them crashing to the ground in a tangle of arms and legs. The impact drove the breath from Samuel's lungs, but he kept fighting. He had to reach Matthew before the other riders did. He had to protect that little boy, no matter what it cost. "Run, Matthew!" Samuel shouted as he grappled with the fallen rider. "Hide!" But when Samuel looked up, he saw something that made his heart stop completely. The other riders weren't chasing Matthew at all. They were surrounding someone else, a small figure in a nightdress who had appeared near the barn. Rebecca had come out of hiding to look for her brother, and now both children were caught in the open, with nowhere to run and no one to protect them but a man who was about to lose his fight with an outlaw twice his size. Samuel heard Rebecca scream his name just as something hard and heavy crashed into the back of his skull. Stars exploded behind his eyes, and the world tilted sideways like a ship in a storm. As darkness closed in around him, Samuel's last thought was a prayer that somehow, some way, those 2 brave children would find a way to survive what was coming next. The sun was beating down like a hammer on an anvil when Samuel woke up, his head feeling like someone had tried to crack it open with a rock. His hands were tied behind his back with rough rope that cut into his wrists, and he was sitting propped against the side of the barn with his legs stretched out in front of him. "Well, look who decided to join us," came a voice that Samuel recognized with a sick feeling in his stomach. The leader of the riders stood over him, blocking out the sun and making everything look dark and threatening. Samuel tried to speak, but his mouth felt full of cotton. He worked his tongue around until he could form words. "Where are the children?" "Safe as houses," the man replied with a cold smile. For now, Samuel's vision cleared enough to see Rebecca and Matthew sitting about 20 feet away, also tied up, but appearing unhurt. Rebecca's eyes met his across the dusty yard, and he could see she was trying to be brave for her little brother's sake. "My name's Cyrus Hawthorne," the leader continued, crouching down so he was eye level with Samuel. "I work for some very important people who don't like it when their property goes missing." "I told you, I don't know anything about any property," Samuel said, testing the ropes around his wrists. They were tight, too tight to slip out of without help. Hawthorne laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, but you do now. See, we had a long conversation with those children while you were taking your nap. Very interesting what kids will tell you when they think someone they care about might get hurt." Samuel's blood ran cold. "You threatened them?" "Didn't have to. Little girl's smart as a whip. Figured out real quick that cooperating was in everyone's best interest." Hawthorne stood up and brushed dust off his pants. "She told us all about Daddy's buried treasure and how he moved it somewhere safe before he died. If you know about it, why do you need us?" "Because Jacob Brennan was smarter than we gave him credit for. He didn't just hide the gold. He hid it somewhere. Only someone who really knew this land could find it. And according to his daughter, he left clues." Samuel looked over at Rebecca again. The girl's face was pale but determined, like someone getting ready to do something difficult but necessary. What was she planning? Hawthorne followed Samuel's gaze and smiled. "Smart little thing, that one. Reminds me of myself at that age. She's going to help us find what we're looking for. And if she can't?" The smile disappeared from Hawthorne's face like smoke in the wind. "Then we'll have to get creative about encouraging her to remember more details." Samuel tested his bonds again, more carefully this time. The rope was new and strong, but whoever had tied him hadn't done a perfect job. If he could work at it slowly, without drawing attention, he might be able to loosen it enough to slip free. "You're wasting your time," Samuel said, trying to keep Hawthorne talking while he worked on the ropes. "Even if there is gold hidden somewhere, what makes you think it's still here? Could have been moved months ago." "Because we've been watching this place," Hawthorne replied. "Brennan never left the ranch after he found it. Never went to town, never hired any help, never did anything that might suggest he was converting gold into cash. Whatever he found, it's still here." One of Hawthorne's men approached from the direction of the house. "Boss, we finished searching the buildings. Nothing there but furniture and farming supplies." "Expected as much," Hawthorne said. Brennan was too smart to keep it close to home. He turned back to Samuel. "Which is where our young friends come in handy." Hawthorne walked over to where the children sat, tied up in the shade of the barn. Samuel watched helplessly as the man knelt down beside Rebecca and spoke to her in a voice that was probably meant to sound friendly, but came out oily and false. "Now then, sweetheart, your papa was a clever man. I'm betting he taught you things about this land. Special places, hiding spots, maybe even some kind of code or riddle to help you remember important things." Rebecca looked up at Hawthorne with eyes that were older than her 8 years. "Why should I help you? You hurt Papa. You're going to hurt us too, no matter what I tell you." "Smart girl," Hawthorne said, and this time his smile looked almost genuine. "You're right. I probably am going to hurt you eventually. But here's the thing. I can hurt you a little, or I can hurt you a lot. That choice is entirely up to you." Samuel felt rage building in his chest like a fire catching dry wood. He pulled harder at the ropes, not caring anymore if someone noticed. He had to get free. He had to protect these children. "Leave her alone," Samuel called out. "She's just a kid." Hawthorne glanced back at him with amusement. "Oh, she's much more than that. She's our treasure map. He turned back to Rebecca. Now, little girl, why don't you tell Uncle Cyrus about the special places your papa showed you? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving from Hawthorne to his men to Samuel and back again. Samuel could practically see her mind working, calculating odds and possibilities, like a much older person would do. Finally she spoke. Papa did show me places, secret places where outlaws used to hide when the law was chasing them. Now we're getting somewhere, Hawthorne said, leaning closer. Tell me about these places. There's caves in the hills north of here, and old mine shafts that go way down into the ground. Papa said they connected to underground streams that run all the way to the big river. Samuel listened to Rebecca's words and felt a spark of hope. She was being too helpful, too willing to share information. The girl was up to something. How far north? Hawthorne pressed. Maybe half a day's ride. Past the summer pasture, where Papa kept the healthy cattle. Rebecca paused, as if remembering something important. Papa always said if something bad happened, I should take Matthew to the summer pasture and wait there. He said help would come. Help from who? Rebecca shrugged. Papa had friends, people who owed him favors. Hawthorne stood up and walked back toward Samuel, his face thoughtful. Interesting. Brennan was setting up an escape plan for his kids. Makes sense he'd hide the gold somewhere along the same route. You're talking about a lot of ground to search, Samuel said. Could take weeks. Not if we have the right guide, Hawthorne replied, looking back at Rebecca. Someone who knows exactly where Papa's special places are. Samuel's heart sank as he realized what Hawthorne was planning. The man intended to take Rebecca with them as they searched for the gold. A little girl, alone with 6 dangerous outlaws, miles from any help. She doesn't know anything more than what she's told you, Samuel said desperately. You've got your information. Now let the children go. Oh, I don't think so, Hawthorne said. See, kids have a way of remembering more details when they're properly motivated. And besides, we might need both of them before this is over. One of Hawthorne's men approached with 3 horses, saddled and ready. Mounts are ready, boss. You want to take all of them? Hawthorne considered this for a moment. The girl comes with us. The boy and our friend here stay behind with Murphy and Jones. If we're not back in 2 days, or if we run into trouble, kill them both. Samuel's blood turned to ice. He looked over at Matthew, who was trying very hard not to cry, and at Rebecca, who looked like she was about to throw up, but was still trying to appear brave. Please, Samuel said, hating how desperate his voice sounded. Take me instead. I can guide you just as well as she can. No, you can't, Hawthorne replied. You've been here exactly 1 day. She's lived here her whole life. He gestured to his men. Get the girl mounted up. We're burning daylight. As 2 of the outlaws moved toward Rebecca, Samuel made one last desperate attempt to free himself from the ropes. He pulled and twisted until his wrists were bloody, but the bonds held firm. Rebecca was lifted onto a horse despite her struggles, her hands still tied in front of her. She looked back at Samuel and Matthew with eyes full of tears. She was too proud to shed. I'll be back, she called out. Take care of Matthew. Rebecca, Matthew cried out, his small voice breaking. Don't leave me. Be brave, Rebecca called back as Hawthorne's horse started moving. Remember what Papa taught us about being brave. Samuel watched helplessly as 4 riders disappeared over the hill, taking Rebecca with them into the vast emptiness of the Nebraska territory. The 2 men left behind, Murphy and Jones, settled in the shade with their rifles across their knees, looking like they were prepared to wait as long as necessary. Matthew was crying openly now, the kind of heartbroken sobs that come from a little boy who's lost everyone he loves. Samuel felt his own tears starting, but he forced them back. Crying wouldn't help anyone right now. Instead, he started thinking. Rebecca had been trying to tell him something with her last words, something about what Papa had taught them, about being brave. What had Jacob Brennan taught his children? And more importantly, how could Samuel use that knowledge to save them all? As the sun climbed higher, and the day grew hotter. Samuel began working on a plan. It wasn't much of a plan, and the odds were terrible, but it was better than sitting tied to a barn post, waiting to die. He just hoped Rebecca could stay alive long enough for him to reach her. The rope finally gave way just as the church bells in the distant town chimed noon, and Samuel's hands were free for the first time in 3 hours. His wrists were raw and bleeding, but he ignored the pain as he quietly worked to untie his feet. Murphy and Jones were playing cards in the shade about 30 feet away, their rifles leaning against the barn wall just out of easy reach. Samuel's heart hammered like a blacksmith's anvil as he slowly, carefully loosened the knots around his ankles. One wrong move, one small sound, and both he and Matthew would be dead before they could blink. The little boy had finally cried himself to sleep, curled up like a wounded animal in the dirt. "Your turn to deal," Murphy said to his partner, tossing down his cards with disgust. "This heat's making me stupid." Jones gathered up the deck and started shuffling. "Hawthorne better find what he's looking for quick. I don't fancy sitting out here much longer with a couple of hostages." "What's the worst that could happen?" Murphy replied, pulling out a flask and taking a long drink. "It's just one man and a baby. Not exactly dangerous." Samuel bit back a bitter smile. These men had made their first mistake. They thought he was harmless. Their second mistake was getting comfortable, and their third mistake was about to be fatal. The knots around his ankles finally came loose. Samuel took a deep breath and considered his options. The Spencer rifle was still inside the house where he dropped it during the fight. The outlaws' rifles were closer but heavily guarded. What he needed was a distraction, something to draw their attention away from him long enough to reach a weapon. Matthew stirred in his sleep and mumbled something about Rebecca. Poor kid was probably having nightmares about his sister being taken away. Samuel made a silent promise to himself. He would bring that little girl home safe or die trying. A horse's whinny from the direction of the corral gave Samuel an idea. If he could spook the animals, create enough noise and confusion, it might give him the opening he needed. The only problem was getting to the corral without being seen. Samuel studied the layout of the ranch yard, mapping out every building, every fence post, every piece of cover between him and his goal. The old chicken coop was about halfway there, then a water trough, then the corral fence itself. If he could make it that far. "I'm telling you, we should have gone with Hawthorne," Jones was saying as he dealt out another hand. "Sitting around babysitting ain't what I signed up for. Boss wants us here. We stay here," Murphy replied, but his voice suggested he wasn't entirely happy about it either. Besides, what could go wrong? That farmer's tied up tighter than a Christmas turkey. Samuel almost laughed out loud at that. Almost. Moving slower than winter molasses, Samuel rolled onto his side and then into a crouch behind the barn wall. The ropes lay where he'd left them, arranged to look like he was still tied up from a distance. As long as the outlaws didn't look too closely, they wouldn't notice anything wrong. Step by step, Samuel crept along the back of the barn toward the chicken coop. Every few seconds he paused to listen, making sure the card players were still focused on their game. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the shade, and his heart beat so loud he was sure the whole world could hear it. He reached the chicken coop without being discovered and paused to catch his breath. From here he could see the horses in the corral, maybe a dozen animals all told. Some belonged to the outlaws. Others were probably ranch stock that had survived whatever killed the cattle in the main pasture. Samuel picked up a handful of small rocks and prepared to throw them at the horses. With luck, the animals would panic and start running around, making enough noise to cover his approach to the house. Without luck, well, he'd be dead in about 10 seconds. "Come on," he whispered to himself. Martha always said fortune favors the bold. Samuel threw the first rock as hard as he could. It struck a large bay horse on the rump, causing the animal to snort and jump sideways. The other horses sensed the excitement and started moving around, but it wasn't enough commotion yet. He threw another rock, then another. The horses began whinnying and tossing their heads, but they were still relatively calm. Samuel needed them genuinely spooked, not just mildly annoyed. That's when he remembered the wooden toy he'd found in the house, Matthew's painted horse with the missing wheel. Samuel pulled it from his pocket, where he'd kept it since the night before. The bright red and yellow paint would be perfect for what he had in mind. Samuel threw the toy horse as hard as he could at the biggest stallion in the corral. The wooden object bounced off the animal's side with a loud crack, and suddenly all hell broke loose. The stallion reared up on his hind legs with a furious neigh, then charged around the corral like his tail was on fire. The other horses caught his panic and joined in, creating a thunderous din of hoofbeats and frightened animal sounds. "What in tarnation?" Murphy jumped to his feet, cards scattering in the dust. "Horses are spooked," Jones replied. But he was looking in the wrong direction, toward the hills where Hawthorne had disappeared with Rebecca. Samuel didn't waste the opportunity. While both outlaws were focused on the corral, he sprinted toward the house faster than he'd ever run in his life. His boots kicked up little puffs of dust, but the noise was completely covered by the chaos in the corral. He reached the front porch and dove through the open doorway, just as Murphy started walking toward the horses to see what was wrong. Samuel's lungs burned from the sprint, but he forced himself to move quietly as he searched for the Spencer rifle. He found it under an overturned table where it had fallen during the fight. The gun was undamaged, and better yet, there were still 4 rounds in the magazine. Samuel checked the action to make sure it was working properly, then positioned himself by the front window. Outside, Murphy had reached the corral and was trying to calm the horses while Jones kept watch from a distance. Both men still had their backs to the house, giving Samuel a perfect shooting position. Samuel took careful aim at Murphy's rifle, which was leaning against the corral fence about 3 feet from where the outlaws stood. If he could destroy or disable their weapons without killing anyone, he might be able to capture both men alive. Dead outlaws couldn't tell him which direction Hawthorne had taken Rebecca. The Spencer boomed like thunder, and Murphy's rifle exploded into splinters as the heavy bullet struck it dead center. Murphy spun around with a curse, his face white with shock. "Drop your weapons!" Samuel shouted from the window. "Both of you, right now!" Jones went for his pistol instead, diving behind the water trough and drawing his gun in one smooth motion. Samuel cursed and fired again, the bullet striking the wooden trough and sending up a spray of water and splinters. "I said drop it," Samuel called out. "Next shot won't be a warning." "Go to hell," Jones replied, popping up to return fire. Samuel ducked as the outlaw's bullet shattered what was left of the window frame above his head. This wasn't going according to plan at all. He'd hoped to end the fight quickly and quietly, but now he was trapped in a gun battle with an experienced killer. Murphy, meanwhile, had drawn his own pistol and was working his way around the side of the corral, trying to get an angle on the house. Samuel realized with growing alarm that he was about to be caught in a crossfire with only 2 rounds left in his rifle. That's when Matthew woke up. The little boy's voice cut through the gunfire like a knife. "Mr. Samuel, where are you?" Samuel's blood turned to ice. Matthew was still tied up behind the barn, completely exposed and defenseless. If either of the outlaws decided to use him as a hostage. "Stay down, Matthew," Samuel shouted. "Don't move." But it was too late. Jones had heard the boy's voice and was already moving in that direction, his pistol ready. Samuel watched in horror as the outlaw disappeared around the corner of the barn. Samuel had seconds to act. He could stay in the house and maintain his defensive position, or he could charge outside and try to reach Matthew before Jones did. Either choice could get them both killed, but only one choice gave the little boy a chance. Samuel broke cover and ran toward the barn, the Spencer rifle clutched in his hands like a lifeline. Behind him, Murphy's pistol cracked twice, the bullets whining past Samuel's head close enough to feel the wind. As Samuel rounded the corner of the barn, he saw Jones standing over Matthew with his gun pointed down at the terrified child. The outlaw's face wore a cold smile that promised nothing good. "Drop the rifle, farmer," Jones called out, "or the boy dies right here, right now." Samuel stopped in his tracks, his mind racing through possibilities. Jones was too far away to rush, too well positioned to outflank, and Matthew was looking up at Samuel with absolute trust, believing somehow that everything would be all right. "Don't hurt him," Samuel said, slowly lowering the Spencer. "He's just a baby." "Should have thought of that before you started shooting," Jones replied. "Now kick that rifle away and get on your knees." Samuel hesitated for just a moment, and in that moment, something unexpected happened. Matthew, still tied hand and foot, suddenly rolled sideways and bit Jones on the leg as hard as he could. The outlaw screamed and jumped back, his pistol wavering away from Matthew for just an instant. It was the opening Samuel had been praying for. Samuel brought the Spencer up and fired in one fluid motion. The bullet caught Jones' center mass and spun him around like a child's top. The outlaw's pistol flew from his hand as he collapsed in the dust, clutching his chest and gasping for air. "Matthew," Samuel called out, rushing to untie the boy. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," Matthew replied, though his voice was shaky. "I remembered what Papa taught us about fighting bullies. Sometimes you got to bite." Samuel almost smiled despite everything. Jacob Brennan had raised one tough little boy. Murphy's voice called out from somewhere behind them. "Jones? You all right over there?" Samuel quickly finished untying Matthew and pulled the boy behind the corner of the barn. Jones was still alive, but badly wounded, in no condition to fight. That left one outlaw against Samuel and a 5-year-old child. "Jones is down," Samuel called back. "Give up now and you won't get hurt." Murphy's answer was a pistol shot that chipped bark off the barn wall inches from Samuel's head. "I got a better idea," Murphy shouted. "You come out with your hands up, or I burn down everything on this ranch, starting with that house full of the dead man's belongings." Samuel felt his heart sink. Murphy was too far away to rush, and he had the high ground behind the water trough. Worse yet, the outlaw was right about the fire threat. In this dry heat, even the green wood of the barn would catch flame if someone really wanted to burn it. But then Samuel heard something that changed everything. The sound of hoofbeats approaching fast from the direction of town. A lot of hoofbeats getting closer by the second. Murphy heard it too. What the devil? Samuel peered around the corner and saw a sight that made his heart leap with hope. A group of riders was coming over the hill at full gallop, led by a man wearing a star-shaped badge that caught the sunlight like a mirror. The cavalry had arrived, but would they be in time to save Rebecca? Marshal Pike's horse slid to a stop in a cloud of dust, and the lawman was out of the saddle before the animal had fully halted. Behind him, 6 men with rifles and grim faces spread out across the ranch yard like they'd done this kind of thing before. Samuel had never been so happy to see a badge in his entire life. "Murphy!" Pike called out, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years wearing a star. "This is United States Marshal Pike. You're surrounded and outgunned. Come out peaceful, and nobody else has to die today." Murphy's answer was a desperate shot in Pike's direction that missed by 3 feet and ricocheted off a metal bucket with a loud clang. The outlaw was clearly rattled by the sudden arrival of the law, but he wasn't ready to surrender yet. "How'd you know to come here?" Samuel called out to Pike, while staying safely behind the barn wall. "Little Birdie told us," Pike replied with a grim smile. "Got word this morning that Cyrus Hawthorne was operating in this area. We've been hunting that snake for 2 years." Samuel felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. If the marshal knew about Hawthorne, maybe there was a chance to save Rebecca before it was too late. "He took the girl," Samuel said urgently. 8-year-old Rebecca Brennan. 4 men on horseback headed north, maybe 3 hours ago. Pike's face darkened like a storm cloud. "Hawthorne's got a child?" "She's guiding them to where her father hid stolen gold. They're planning to kill her when they find it." Pike exchanged glances with his men, and Samuel could see the calculation in their eyes. 3 hours was a significant head start, especially for men who knew the territory and had no reason to expect pursuit. "How well does the girl know the country up north?" Pike asked. Samuel thought about Rebecca's words before she was taken away. "Better than anyone. She grew up here." Then she's got a chance, Pike said. Smart kid might be able to lead them in circles. Buy us some time. He turned to his deputies. Johnson, Williams, you stay here and secure the scene. Rest of you mount up. We're riding north. Wait, Samuel said, stepping out from behind the barn with Matthew in his arms. I'm coming with you. Pike looked at Samuel like he'd suggested jumping off a cliff. No offense, mister, but this is law business, and you've got a wounded child to look after. I'm not wounded, Matthew spoke up from Samuel's arms. And Rebecca's my sister. I want to help find her. Pike's expression softened slightly as he looked at the determined little boy. Son, this is going to be dangerous work. Men like Hawthorne don't think twice about killing lawmen, let alone civilians. With respect, Marshal, Samuel said, I know this ranch better than any of your men, and I know Rebecca. If she's trying to mislead Hawthorne, I might be able to figure out where she's really taking them. Pike considered this for a long moment, while his men finished securing Murphy and checking on the wounded Jones. Finally, he nodded. You can come, but the boy stays here with my deputies. No, Matthew said quickly. I want to go with you. Rebecca needs me. Samuel knelt down so he was eye level with the little boy. Matthew, listen to me. The best way you can help Rebecca right now is by staying here where it's safe. When we bring her back, she's going to need you to be brave and strong for her. Matthew's lower lip trembled, but he didn't cry. Promise you'll bring her back? I promise, Samuel said, hoping it was a promise he could keep. 10 minutes later, Samuel was mounted on one of the ranch horses and riding hard across the Nebraska grassland, alongside 4 federal marshals. The sun was past its peak now, and heat waves shimmered up from the ground like dancing spirits. Pike rode beside Samuel, occasionally checking a compass and studying the terrain ahead. Tell me about this gold, the marshal said. How much are we talking about? Samuel told him everything Rebecca had revealed, about Jacob Brennan finding buried coins, about Hawthorne's threats, about the mysterious hiding place somewhere near the summer pasture. Sounds like the Deadwood Bank job, Pike said when Samuel finished. 15,000 in gold coins stolen from a stage shipment 2 years ago. We never found the money or caught the robbers. You think Jacob Brennan was involved? Doubt it. More likely, he stumbled across where the real thieves buried their loot. Wrong place, wrong time. Pike spat into the dust. But Hawthorne's been tracking down leads on that gold ever since. He's not the kind to give up easy. They rode in silence for a while, following hoofprints that were still clearly visible in the soft earth. Samuel found himself thinking about Rebecca, hoping she was staying strong and smart. That little girl had already been through more than most adults could handle. As they crested a low hill, Pike suddenly held up his hand for the group to stop. In the distance, maybe 2 miles ahead, they could see dust clouds rising into the still air. That's them, Pike said grimly. Question is, are they still moving or have they stopped? Samuel shaded his eyes against the sun and studied the dust patterns. Looks like they're stopped. Maybe they found what they were looking for. Or maybe the girl convinced them to make camp for the day, Pike replied. Either way, we need to get closer without being seen. The marshals dismounted and led their horses into a small draw where the animals wouldn't be visible from a distance. Pike pulled out a pair of field glasses and studied the area where they'd seen the dust. Definitely stopped, he reported. Looks like they're camped by a stream, maybe half a mile this side of those hills. Samuel felt his heart racing. They were close now, close enough to attempt a rescue, but close enough to get Rebecca killed if they made a mistake. What's the plan? Samuel asked. Pike lowered the glasses and looked at his men. Standard approach. We circle around, come at them from 2 directions, but we have to be careful. One wrong move, and that little girl pays the price. I should go in first, Samuel said. Alone, if I can get close enough to create a distraction. Absolutely not, Pike cut him off. You're not trained for this kind of work. But I am trained to care about those children, Samuel replied. And sometimes caring is more important than training. Pike studied Samuel's face for a long moment. You really think you can get close without being spotted? Samuel thought about his years farming in Missouri, about all the times he'd tracked wounded animals through thick woods, about the patience Martha had taught him when hunting for the family table. I grew up in the country, Samuel said. I know how to move quiet. All right, Pike said finally. But you follow my lead. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We want everyone to come home alive. Samuel nodded, though privately, he knew he'd take any risk necessary to save Rebecca. That little girl had become family to him in the space of just 2 days, and family was worth dying for. The group spent 20 minutes working their way closer to Hawthorne's camp, using every bit of cover the rolling prairie offered. When they were within a quarter mile, Pike called another halt. This is as close as we get with the horses, he whispered. From here we go on foot. Samuel checked the Spencer rifle one more time and made sure he had extra cartridges in his pocket. His hands were steady, but his heart was hammering like a trip hammer in his chest. As they crept through the tall grass toward the camp, Samuel caught his first glimpse of Rebecca in hours. The little girl was sitting by a small fire, her hands still tied, but her head held high. She looked tired and scared, but unharmed. Hawthorne and his 3 remaining men were clustered around a map spread out on a flat rock, arguing in low voices about something. Samuel couldn't hear the words, but their body language suggested frustration and growing anger. She's been leading them in circles, Pike whispered with admiration. Smart girl. Samuel felt a surge of pride. Rebecca was playing for time, trying to stay alive long enough for help to arrive. Now it was up to them to make sure her courage wasn't wasted. Pike positioned his men in a semicircle around the camp, each one with a clear field of fire, but careful to avoid hitting Rebecca if shooting started. Samuel found himself directly across from where the girl sat, maybe 50 yards away through the grass. When I give the signal, Pike whispered, we all stand up at once and demand surrender. Element of surprise is our best weapon. Samuel nodded and gripped his rifle tighter. In a few seconds, everything would be decided. Either they'd save Rebecca and capture Hawthorne, or they'd all be dead in the grass. Pike raised his hand, counting down silently. 3, 2, 1. Federal marshals, Pike shouted, rising up out of the grass with his rifle ready. Nobody move. For a split second, the camp froze like a photograph. Then chaos exploded as Hawthorne and his men dove for cover and started shooting. Samuel saw Rebecca roll away from the fire toward a pile of rocks, moving fast despite her bound hands. Bullets whined through the air above his head as he tried to get a clear shot at one of the outlaws. The gun battle was fierce but brief. 2 of Hawthorne's men went down in the first exchange of fire, and the third surrendered when he found himself surrounded. But when the smoke cleared, Cyrus Hawthorne was nowhere to be seen, and neither was Rebecca. A child's terrified scream echoed from somewhere deep inside the cave, and Samuel's blood turned to ice as he recognized Rebecca's voice calling for help. The sound bounced off the rocky walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once, making it impossible to tell which direction Hawthorne had taken her in the maze of underground tunnels. This way, Pike whispered urgently, pointing his lantern down the left passage. Sound carries better through that opening. Samuel shook his head, his farmer's instincts telling him something different. No, listen, there's air moving from the right tunnel. That means it connects to the surface somewhere. Hawthorne would want an escape route. The marshal hesitated for a crucial second, torn between his own judgment and Samuel's. Behind them, the other deputies were still searching the area around the cave entrance, looking for any sign of which direction the outlaw had gone. Another scream came from the depths, this one weaker and more desperate. Rebecca was running out of time, and they were running out of options. We split up, Pike decided grimly. You take the right passage, I'll take the left. First one to find them fires 2 shots to signal the others. Samuel nodded and plunged into the right-hand tunnel without waiting for more discussion. The Spencer rifle felt heavy in his hands as he moved forward step by careful step, using the dim light filtering down from above to guide his way. The tunnel was narrow and twisted like a snake, forcing Samuel to duck low in several places where the ceiling dropped down. Water dripped constantly from somewhere overhead, creating an eerie echo that mixed with his own breathing and footsteps. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Samuel came to a place where the tunnel split into 3 different directions. He stopped and listened carefully, trying to hear any sound that might tell him which way to go. That's when he heard it, not Rebecca's voice this time, but Hawthorne's, coming from the middle passage and getting closer. "Stupid girl thinks she's so clever," the outlaw was muttering to himself. "Leading us down here like we don't know these caves connect to the old mine workings. Well, she's about to learn what happens to clever little girls." Samuel pressed himself against the cave wall and waited, his heart pounding so loud he was sure Hawthorne would hear it. The outlaw appeared a moment later, dragging Rebecca behind him with one hand, while holding a pistol in the other. Rebecca looked exhausted and frightened, but Samuel was relieved to see she didn't appear to be seriously hurt. Her dress was torn and dirty, and there was a small cut on her forehead, but she was walking on her own and her eyes were still alert. "Please," Rebecca was saying as they passed Samuel's hiding spot. "I told you where Papa hid the gold. It's in the old mine shaft, just like I said. You don't need me anymore." "Oh, but I do," Hawthorne replied with a cold laugh. "See, your Papa was smarter than I gave him credit for. He didn't just hide the gold, he booby-trapped it. And I'm going to need someone small and expendable to test whether those traps are still working." Samuel felt rage build in his chest like a fire catching dry wood. Hawthorne was planning to use Rebecca as a human canary, sending her into danger to spring any traps Jacob Brennan might have set. Samuel waited until they had passed, then began following at a distance. The tunnel continued downward at a steep angle, and the air grew colder as they went deeper underground. Strange echoes suggested they were entering a much larger space. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber carved out of solid rock. Old mining equipment lay scattered around like the bones of some ancient beast, and wooden support beams stretched up into the darkness overhead. But what caught Samuel's attention was the sight of fresh digging near the back wall of the chamber. Someone had been excavating recently, and the hole was just the right size for a person to crawl through. "There," Hawthorne said, pointing at the opening with his pistol. "Your Papa's hidey hole. Now you're going to crawl in there and bring out what belongs to my employers." "What if there are traps?" Rebecca asked, her voice small and frightened. "Then you'll find out real quick," Hawthorne replied. "But don't worry, if something bad happens to you, it'll be over fast." Samuel had heard enough. He stepped out of the tunnel entrance with the Spencer rifle raised and ready. "Let her go, Hawthorne," Samuel called out, his voice echoing strangely in the large chamber. "It's over." Hawthorne spun around, his pistol swinging toward Samuel, but he kept one hand firmly gripped on Rebecca's arm. "Well, well," the outlaw said with a nasty smile. "The farmer with more guts than brains. How did you find us?" "Lucky guess," Samuel replied, keeping the rifle trained on Hawthorne's chest. "Now release the girl, and we can settle this between us." "I don't think so," Hawthorne said, pulling Rebecca closer and pressing his pistol against her head. "See, this little sweetheart is my insurance policy. You drop that rifle, or she dies right here." Samuel felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool air in the cave. Hawthorne had the advantage of position and a human shield. One wrong move, and Rebecca would pay the price. "You're trapped down here," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Marshal Pike and his men are searching every tunnel. Even if you kill both of us, you'll never make it out alive." "Maybe not," Hawthorne admitted, "but I'll have the satisfaction of knowing you didn't either." Rebecca suddenly spoke up, her voice surprisingly calm for a child with a gun pointed at her head. "Mr. Samuel, the gold isn't in that hole." Both men looked at her in surprise. Hawthorne's grip tightened on her arm. "What are you talking about?" the outlaw demanded. "Papa never hid anything down here," Rebecca continued. "I've been leading you away from the real hiding place all day." Hawthorne's face turned red with fury. "You little liar! She's telling the truth," Samuel said, suddenly understanding Rebecca's plan. "You've been chasing shadows, while the real treasure sits somewhere else entirely." "Where?" Hawthorne snarled, his pistol wavering between Samuel and Rebecca. Rebecca looked directly at Samuel, and in her eyes he saw a message he hoped he was reading correctly. "It's back at the ranch," she said clearly. "Papa buried it under the old oak tree by the creek, the same tree where he found it in the first place." Samuel felt his heart skip a beat. The oak tree by the creek, that was where Rebecca had said her father originally discovered the gold. If Jacob Brennan had moved it somewhere safe, bringing it full circle to where it started would be exactly the kind of thinking that would appeal to a careful man. But more importantly, if Rebecca was telling the truth, it meant they could end this standoff without anyone getting hurt. "You're lying," Hawthorne said, but his voice held a note of uncertainty. "Am I?" Rebecca challenged. "Papa always said the best hiding place is the one people already looked at and dismissed. You searched that tree area on your first visit and didn't find anything because you were looking for fresh digging. But Papa was smarter than that." Hawthorne's eyes narrowed as he considered this. Samuel could practically see the wheels turning in the outlaw's head as he weighed the possibilities. "Even if that's true," Hawthorne said finally, "it doesn't change anything. The girl comes with me until I verify the location." "No deal," Samuel replied firmly. "You want to check the tree? You go alone. Rebecca stays here." "Then we have ourselves a problem," Hawthorne said, raising his pistol again. That's when the sound Samuel had been hoping for finally came. 2 quick gunshots from somewhere behind them, echoing through the tunnels. Pike's signal. The marshal had found the cave system and was on his way. Hawthorne heard the shots too, and his face went pale as he realized his situation had just gotten much worse. "Time's up," Samuel said. "Surrender now, and you might live to see trial." For a moment, Hawthorne seemed to be considering it. Then his face hardened with desperate resolve. "If I'm going down," he said, "I'm taking both of you with me." Hawthorne started to swing his pistol toward Samuel. But Rebecca wasn't done being clever. As the outlaw's attention focused on Samuel, she suddenly went completely limp, her small body becoming dead weight in Hawthorne's grip. The unexpected shift in balance threw Hawthorne off for just a second, but it was enough. Samuel fired the Spencer rifle, the boom echoing like thunder in the underground chamber. The bullet caught Hawthorne in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the darkness. The outlaw crashed into a pile of old mining equipment and lay still, groaning in pain. Samuel rushed to Rebecca's side, his hands shaking as he checked her for injuries. The little girl looked up at him with eyes that held relief and exhaustion in equal measure. "Are you hurt?" Samuel asked urgently. "I'm okay," Rebecca replied, though her voice was wobbly. "Is it really over?" Samuel pulled her into a gentle hug, feeling tears he hadn't expected burning behind his eyes. "It's over. You're safe now." Footsteps echoed from the tunnel entrance as Pike and his men finally found their way to the chamber. The marshal took one look at the scene and shook his head with something that might have been admiration. "Remind me never to underestimate farmers," Pike said dryly. "Or 8-year-old girls." As the deputies secured Hawthorne and prepared to haul him back to the surface, Samuel helped Rebecca to her feet. The little girl was exhausted, but there was something in her expression that looked almost like satisfaction. "Rebecca," Samuel said quietly, "is there really gold buried under that oak tree?" Rebecca looked up at him with a small smile that reminded him powerfully of her father. "I guess we'll have to go look and see, won't we?" The morning sun painted the Nebraska grassland golden as Samuel walked hand in hand with Rebecca and Matthew toward the old oak tree by the creek. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the cave, and life at the ranch was finally starting to feel normal, or at least as normal as it could be for a grieving widower raising 2 orphaned children. Marshal Pike and his men had left the previous day, taking Hawthorne and his surviving gang members back to face federal charges. The outlaw's shoulder wound had healed enough for him to travel, though he'd said very little during his recovery except to curse Jacob Brennan's name. "Are you sure about this?" Samuel asked Rebecca as they approached the massive tree that had started all their troubles. "We don't have to look if you don't want to." Rebecca squeezed his hand tighter. "Papa would want us to know the truth. And besides, if there really is gold there, it belongs to whoever it was stolen from." Matthew ran ahead to the base of the tree, his energy restored now that his sister was safely home. The little boy had barely left Rebecca's side since the rescue, as if he was afraid she might disappear again if he wasn't watching. "Where should we dig?" Matthew called back to them. Rebecca studied the area around the tree with the serious expression she wore when thinking hard about something. The ground looked undisturbed, covered with fallen leaves and normal prairie grass. "Papa always said that if you want to hide something, you should put it where people expect to see something else," Rebecca said thoughtfully. "Everyone who looks at this tree sees a tree. But Papa saw." She walked around to the far side of the oak, where the massive trunk split into two main branches, about 4 feet from the ground. Between the branches was a hollow space, naturally formed and just the right size for a child to climb into. He saw a hiding place that didn't require digging. Rebecca finished with a smile. Samuel looked up at the hollow and shook his head with admiration. Jacob Brennan had been cleverer than anyone gave him credit for. While Hawthorne and his men searched for signs of fresh digging, the gold had been sitting 12 feet off the ground in plain sight. "Can you climb up there?" Samuel asked. "I've been climbing this tree since I was little," Rebecca replied. "Papa used to say I was part squirrel." She scrambled up the trunk with the easy grace of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. Matthew watched from below, his face bright with excitement. "There's something here," Rebecca called down. "Leather bags, just like I told you about." Samuel felt his heart start beating faster. After all they'd been through, it seemed almost impossible that they were actually going to find the legendary gold. Rebecca lowered down 3 heavy leather pouches, each one tied with strong cord and marked with what looked like bank stamps. Samuel opened the first bag and felt his breath catch in his throat. Gold coins spilled out into his palm, more money than he'd ever seen in his life. The second and third bags held even more, along with some paper currency and what looked like jewelry. $15,000, Samuel said quietly, remembering what Marshal Pike had told him about the Deadwood bank robbery. "Maybe more." "What do we do with it?" Matthew asked, his eyes wide at the sight of so much treasure. Samuel looked at the children, these 2 brave souls who had become his family in such a short time. The money could solve all their problems. Buy supplies for the ranch, hire help, send the children to proper schools, secure their future in ways he'd never dreamed possible. But it wasn't theirs. It belonged to the bank that had been robbed, to the customers who had lost their savings, to people who had worked hard for money that was stolen from them. "We give it back," Samuel said firmly. "Your papa found it, but he never got the chance to return it to its rightful owners. We'll do it for him." Rebecca nodded solemnly. "Papa would like that. He always said stolen things never brought anything but trouble to the people who kept them." As they walked back toward the house, the children chattering excitedly about their discovery, Samuel found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them all together. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a desperate man with $1 to his name and nowhere to go. Now, he was responsible for 2 children, a working ranch, and enough honest work to keep them all busy for years to come. The cattle drive to bring the herd down from summer pasture was scheduled for next week. Pike had confirmed that the animals up there were healthy and numerous, more than enough to make the ranch profitable, if managed properly. With the money from selling the cattle, plus what they could earn from working the land, they'd be able to build a good life here. But more than that, they'd be able to build a family. "Mr. Samuel?" Rebecca said as they reached the front porch. "What should we call you now? I mean, you're not really our papa, but you're not exactly just Mr. either." Samuel knelt down so he was eye level with both children. This was a conversation he'd been thinking about for days, wondering how to approach it without overstepping boundaries or presuming too much. "What would you like to call me?" he asked gently. Matthew spoke up immediately. Could we call you Papa Samuel, like you're our papa now, but different from our old papa? Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Would that be all right with you, Rebecca? The little girl studied his face with those serious eyes that always seemed older than her years. Papa used to say that family isn't just about blood. It's about people who choose to love each other and stick together no matter what. He was a wise man, Samuel said. So yes, Rebecca continued with a small smile. I think Papa Samuel would be just right. That evening, as Samuel tucked both children into the bed they shared upstairs, he reflected on how much their lives had changed. The house that had been torn apart by outlaws was slowly being repaired and made into a real home again. The corrals that had stood empty were being prepared for the cattle drive. The fields that had lain fallow were being planned for next spring's planting. But most importantly, the silence that had filled the house since Jacob Brennan's death was being replaced with the sounds of living, children's laughter, conversations around the dinner table, plans being made for tomorrow and next week and next year. Papa Samuel? Matthew said sleepily from his pillow. Are you going to stay with us forever? Samuel smoothed the little boy's hair and smiled. As long as you'll have me, son. This is home now. As he walked downstairs to bank the fire and lock up for the night, Samuel paused at the kitchen window to look out at the moonlit prairie. Somewhere out there, Marshal Pike was escorting prisoners to justice. Somewhere else, families were going to get their stolen money back. And right here, in a house that had been bought for $1 and paid for with courage, 3 people who had lost everything were building something new together. Samuel pulled the deed from his pocket one more time and read his name on the official paper. Samuel Carter, legal owner of the Brennan Ranch. But the deed didn't tell the whole story. It didn't mention that the ranch came with 2 children who needed a father, or that it would cost him every ounce of strength and love he had to give. It didn't mention that sometimes the best bargains in life weren't measured in dollars and cents, but in second chances and newfound family, and the knowledge that home wasn't a place you owned. It was a place where people loved you enough to call you theirs. Samuel folded the deed and put it away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, cattle to tend, fields to work, children to raise. But tonight, for the first time since Martha's death, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. The Dollar Ranch had cost him everything he thought he wanted, and given him everything he never knew he needed. And as Samuel climbed the stairs toward bed, he could hear the soft breathing of 2 sleeping children who trusted him to keep them safe. And he knew that was worth more than all the gold in Nebraska territory. Outside, the wind whispered across the prairie grass, carrying stories of new beginnings and unexpected families, and the truth that sometimes the most valuable things in life come to those who have nothing left to lose but everything left to give.